In this video, we are going to talk about what was happening in the Indian subcontinent after the fall of the Mauryas. In historical terminology, this period is called the post-Mauryan period. And we find that in order for us to understand what was happening in the post-Mauryan period, we have to talk about the end of the Mauryas or how the Mauryan Empire declined. So when it comes to the end of the Mauryas, we find that there are multiple theories that deals with the decline of the Mauryas. And of these multiple theories, I think two theories are of importance to us and we should discuss it. So the first theory talks about the fact that it was because of Ashoka's pacifist policies that the Mauryan Empire declined. So this theory is arguing that because Ashok became a non-violent Buddhist, he abandoned his armies, and that is why the Mauryan Empire after the death of Ashok became victim to the invaders that came after the death of Ashok. Now this theory has certain problems. So the first problem and a major one comes from the fact that we do not have enough evidence to support the fact that Ashok became a non-violent Buddhist. Now when we read the Ashokan edicts, nowhere it is mentioned that Ashok abandoned his armies and became a pacifist. So this problem with this theory is quite significant. Now coming to the second theory, this theory argues that after the death of Ashok, the Mauryan Empire was divided into two parts. And because it was divided, it could not control the invasions that were coming from the northwest, and that is why, because of a lack of central authority, the Mauryan Empire declined. Now this theory suffers from the same problem which the first theory suffers, that is lack of evidence. We do not have enough evidence to prove that the Mauryan Empire did divide into two parts. So this is the major problem with this theory as well. Now coming to the question of the later Mauryans or the Mauryans who came after Ashok, we find that there is a great debate about the Mauryan kings who came after Ashok. We don't know who came after him, and we do not even know how long these rulers ruled. We only know because of the Puranas that the Mauryan Empire or the Mauryan rule ended around 187 BC, or in some other books you will find the date is 185 BC. Although we do not know anything about the later Mauryan kings, and we also don't know the reasons why the Mauryan Empire declined, but what we do know is that the first effects of what would happen after the fall of the Mauryan empires started emerging in the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent. So when we look at the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent, we find here the Bactrian province of the Selucid Empire was situated. And around 258 BC, when Ashok still ruled the Mauryan Empire, this province revolted and became an independent kingdom. In 208 BC, the Seleucid Emperor Antiochus III did try to gain back these territories, but eventually he failed and he acknowledged the independence of the Bactrian Greeks. Having gained their independence, we find that it was from now on the main target of the Bactrian Greeks were the territories of the Mauryan Empire. Now we find that this incursions of the Indo-Greek or the Bactrian Greek as they were now called started around the end of 3rd century BC. And when it comes to the incursions of the Indo-Greek, we find that these incursions happened in stages. So the first stage saw the conquest of the territories west of the Khyber Pass in the north and in the south west of the Indus River. And it was Demetrius first who conquered these territories. Now before I talk about the events that happened after this invasion, I think we should first talk about the problems which historians face when they write about the Indo-Greeks. So when it comes to the Indo-Greeks, we find that whether we are talking about the Indian sources or whether we are talking about the Latin or Greek sources, there is not enough information about the Indo-Greeks that is available to historians. historians. And that is why historians rely mostly on the Indo-Greek coins. Although there are some reference in Puranas and there are also some Indo-Greek inscriptions, but we find that in order to construct chronologies of these Indo-Greek kings, it is the coins of these kings that are helpful. And that is why, because historians mainly rely on these coins, there is a great debate about these chronologies. So you should remember that what I'm going to tell you is a version of the Indo-Greek history. There are other scholars who have some different point of view. Now coming back to Demetrius first, we find that it is around 185 BC that Demetrius first dies. After his death, the second stage of the Indo-Greek expansion took place. Now this stage is around 185 BC to 165 BC. Now most of these dates are rough estimates and there are no exact date when we talk about the Indo-Greeks. So now this stage, that is the second stage, was focused in the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent and particularly the Gandhar region. During this stage, that the region of Gandhar became part of the Indo-Greek kingdom, and it is from this period onwards that the city of Takshila became known as the center of Indo-Greek culture. Now, having established their rule in the Gandharan territory, the Indo-Greeks embarked on the third stage of their conquest. This third stage is mostly known to us from the Yuga Purana. Yuga Purana tells us that a Yavana army came and besieged the city of Patliputra. Yuga Purana does not tell us who this Yavana king was. Now what I believe is that it was Menander who besieged the city of Patliputra. Other scholars argue that it was Demetrius first who besieged the city of Patliputra. Now you would say that how can Demetrius first, who had died around 185 BC, can besiege a city? So the fact is that I follow a different chronology and these historians follow a different chronology. We can talk about this debate in some other videos, but the fact remains is that a Yavana king did conquer the city of Patliputra. Yuga Purana tells us that the Yavanas retreated soon after conquering the city of Patliputra. Now from all of this episode, what we can ascertain is that the region of northern part of the Indian subcontinent became the center of Indo-Greek power. And from the Indo-Greeks, this region would pass on to the Shakas. The Shakas became powerful in this region around 100 BC. And we find that after the Shakas, the Pahlavas or the Indo-Parthians came. And after the Indo-Parthians, this region would finally pass on to the Kushanas. The Kushanas ruled this region for at least a century. Now here we will leave the Kushanas and talk about other regions of the Indian subcontinent. In the Deccan region, after the fall of the Mauryan Empire, we find that the Satavahanas became an important power, and the invasion of the Kushanas greatly impacted the Satavahanas as well. We find that because of this invasion, the Shakas who controlled the Mathura region moved to the region of Gujarat, and from Gujarat region they became an important player in the Deccan region as well. We know these Shakas as Western Kshatraps, and the establishment of the Shaka rule in Gujarat region would start a rivalry which was one of the greatest rivalry in ancient Indian history, and this rivalry would last more than a century. We are talking about the rivalry between the Satavahanas and the Western Kshatraps. Now moving to the deep south, we find that the period between 3rd century BC to 3rd century AD was the period of Sangam age. In the region of Tamilakam, during this period, 3 crowned kings dominated the entire historical map of the ancient Tamilakam region. These were the Cholas, the Pandyas and the Cheras. Moving to the Odisha region, which was the ancient Kalinga region, we find that after the fall of the Mauryan Empire, the Mahamegvahan dynasty became prominent and they achieved independence from the Mauryan rules. One of the greatest ruler of this dynasty was KHARAVELA. But sadly, like many dynasties of ancient India, we know very little about the Mahamegvahan dynasty. Most of the information about Kharvel comes from an inscription that is found near the city of Bhubaneswar. And from this inscription, we have most of the information about Kharvel. And because of this fact, we do not have enough information about the other rulers of this dynasty, and we also do not know when did Kharvel ruled. Now this is what happening in the Kalingan region. So from Kalingan region, we move north and enter the territory of Magad. We have started our story with this region, and we find that according to the Puranas, the Mauryan rule ended around 187 BC. Puranas and other sources tell us that it was Pushyamitra Shunga, the general of the last Mauryan emperor Brihadrath, who assassinated his king and became the ruler of the Shunga dynasty. Now, like different parts of Indian history, about Pushyamitra Shunga, we have little information. There is debate about his reign or the chronology of his reign, but what we do know is that his empire was significantly smaller than the Mauryan Empire. And according to the Puranas, the successors of Pushyamitra Shunga ruled for around 112 years. And it was around 75 BC that the Shunga dynasty came to an end. After the Shungas, if we believe the Puranas, came the Karnavas, and the origin of the Karnavas can be ascertained from their title, which is found in the Puranas. In the Puranas, these Karnavas are called Shunga Bhrityas, that is, the servants of the Shungas. We find that the story of how the Shunga rule ended and the Kanva rule began is given in Bana's Harshcharit. In Bana's Harshcharit, we are told that the last Shunga ruler Devbhuti was killed by his minister Vasudev, and it was Vasudev who became the first ruler of the Karnava line. But the Karnavas were marginal player in this period's history, because we find that it was the Magadhan territory which they only controlled. And from the rule of the Karnavas and up until the rise of the Guptas, the Magadhan region would become a political backwater, and it would have little to no influence in the politics of the post-Mauryan period. But the region westwards of Magad was controlled by the Kushanas, and we find that at their peak, the region around the city of Varanasi was under the Kushan rule. After the fall of the Kushanas, which happened around the end of 2nd century AD, we find that in the northern part of the Indian subcontinent, and particularly in the territories which we now call the Punjab region, Haryana, and some parts of Rajasthan, some republics began to emerge. Now, these republics, according to different Indian sources, were republics that were known for their warriors. And that is why these republics are sometimes called warrior republics. In central India, the end of Kushan rule gave way to the Nagas, about whom we know very little. Now, most of the small kingdoms that emerged after the end of the Kushan rule continued up until the rise of the Guptas. And it was only with the rise of the Guptas that these small kingdoms were incorporated into the expanding Gupta Empire. So what we have in front of us after the decline of the Mauryan Empire is a politically fragmented scene. And this situation becomes even more difficult when we find that there is little to no information about most of the kingdoms that emerged after the decline of the Mauryas. And that is why this period, that is the post-Mauryan periods, is sometimes called the dark period in Indian history because of the lack of sources which we have about this period. So this was an overview of the post-Mauryan India. Now, about the different powers which I have discussed in this video, I have talked about them in my earlier videos. And if you want to watch these videos, you can see the description where I have provided you the list. Thank you for watching.